The darkest secrets of one of the most awarded comic book writers of recent decades have begun to come to light. When in February of 2022, Scarlett Pavlovich asked Amanda Palmer if they could have a private dinner, she said she had something important to tell her, which she might not take well. Scarlett had started working as a nanny a few days before, looking after the son Amanda had with her Amanda's ex-husband. It's none other than Neil Gaiman, the award-winning author of Sandman, a comic that eventually got its adaptation on Netflix. Coraline, American Gods, and so many other works that have been building his enormous reputation since the 80s. The qualifier of living legend and a not at all despicable fortune. Scarlett had to take a deep breath before she let out what she released. Amanda told her that at a moment when they had been alone, Neil had invited her to take a bath, only to later appear naked and abuse her trust. Despite her repeated refusals, he had touched her inappropriately and then masturbated over her. Before doing so, he had told her to call him Master. Amanda turned pale. Upon hearing this, Scarlett told her, trembling, that it was just the beginning. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Gaiman was seen as quite an eminence. The height of his ideas was always emphasized. He has been a fervent defender of various social causes and has adhered to several struggles initiated by feminism. He was basically a respected author and apparently committed to his work as a communicator. He was a nightmare creator in the world of fiction, but he fought for a brighter world from his role as a creator. Or is that what was thought almost unanimously until a few months ago? Today things took on other tones. Today, this famous writer seems to have become a monster worthy of one of his stories. From June of 2023 until now, various testimonies have been collected that would attest that the man, who is now 64 years old, was never who he claimed to be. When did the abuses start? What did he do to his victims? What is this individual's particular and murky link to the Church of Scientology? In an attempt to answer these and other questions, we have prepared this report where we will delve into the darkest side of Neil Gaiman. Keep in mind that this case is happening right now, so the story is still developing. The data may change, something new might appear, there may be new testimonies that perhaps lag behind. With what we're recounting at the time we're recording this, if anything new comes out, we might do a second part, I'm not guaranteeing it. If you're interested in a second part about this case, write the word writer in the comments. If there are more than 200 people writing writer, we're going to make a second part with updates, and if not, we'll leave it here. Let's start the mysterious early years. Since becoming famous, Neil Gaiman has done many interviews, talks, and classes. He spoke on a variety of philosophical topics, about the power of stories, about his works, about the present state of culture, about the craft of writing, and his own experience in the field. However, he always deliberately avoided discussing his childhood. Despite always honoring the innocence and purity of childhood, he was rarely heard talking about his days as a child. And there are not a few who believe that in that undisclosed past, there would be a terrible genesis. Especially when considering that Gaiman grew up within a sect. His parents, David and Sheila, left their formal jobs in 1965 when he was 5 years old. And they moved to what was then known as the world headquarters of the Church of Scientology. In fact, it is known today that for 2 years young Neil lived just a few meters away from 50. Ron Hubbard, a science fiction writer, who later became a founder of that doctrine that had deeply influenced the beliefs of his parents. If you want to know more about Scientology, about all this theory they have about extraterrestrials, about its creator and all this, I invite you to watch the video we made on this channel about Scientology. Look for it there, you put Scientology Magnus and it appears. We'll leave you the link at the end. Let's continue. As David and Sheila were among the first followers of Scientology in England, they quickly received special treatment for their commitment. Moving on to 1967. Precisely, when Hubbard was already taking refuge in international waters to avoid being caught by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Neil's parents held important positions in the institution. The Gaimans were in charge of the church's public relations, as well as the intelligence it carried out to dismiss its detractors. By the early 70s, they were considered official spokespeople for the project. In fact, when Neil was 8 years old, he was featured on a British Broadcasting Corporation program by his own father. The special aimed to showcase the benefits that Scientology could provide for children growing up within it. Facing the interviewer, Neil smiled and said it was amazing to be a part of all that. He seemed like a sincere kid, but the truth is that there was always speculation about what things were like behind the cameras. Years later, it was discovered that one of the axioms of Scientology is to understand children as souls that are already adult. So often children are treated as adults, exploiting them or subjecting them to various abuses. Not to mention that the disciplinary measures of Scientology would include, for example, immersing disobedient children in cold water. Did Neil go through all those torments? He never wanted to delve into the topic. Yes, it is known that as a teenager, he worked as a minister of the congregation, auditing potential entrants. He was the first to achieve that role so young. It is believed that from these tasks stems his ability for oratory and his calm and enveloping tone when narrating. Apparently, he was destined for great things there until his father fell out with another faction of believers. And overnight, all that power he had evaporated. He was accused of improper actions and his rank plummeted abruptly, plunging him into oblivion. It was at that moment that Neil knew he had to find a life outside of Scientology. This is how he started his training as a journalist, covering rock shows and events. But his imagination was screaming to be set free. He had grown up in a closed cult, so he knew the great influence that what were considered divine scriptures had. So he set out to write his own. Only he didn't dream of a Bible, he wanted to tell stories and conquer the general public. He had faith in himself and was sure that he knew how to achieve it. And of course, he was not mistaken. The power of Gaiman. Gaiman found major success with the Sandman saga, transforming an obscure character into an instant icon. His version of the Lord of Dreams, always melancholic, suffering, powerful, charismatic and bearer of an emo aesthetic, earned him the outright acceptance of the fans. But not only that, critics have always highlighted his scripts, highlighting the intellectual air of the work. From then on, Gaiman was considered a rarity for his ability to blend pop culture references with classic author quotes. A writer who seemed out of time, who knew all the past, but seemed destined to conquer the future. He seemed to have the gift of pleasing teenagers, but also those who argued that comics were not just kids' stuff. His mythology was applauded and soon earned him awards from the most prestigious. Gaiman was under 30 and the world was at his feet. He proved his success was no fluke through another 30 years of career that followed. Step by step, he sealed his talent and became a brand in himself. He wrote novels, stories, opinion pieces, films and more. By the early 2000s, it was impossible for him to walk through a comic convention without his fans pouncing on him. He had generated a magnetism that made many boys or girls, often dressed in black, profess their love to him. It was rumored that Neil was somewhat prone to giving out his number to young girls, and many smiled at hearing this. What was the problem? They wondered. After all, he was some kind of rock star in the comic world who enjoyed doing it. No one suspected then that terrible testimonies would later emerge. For a long time, Neil Gaiman presented himself as a lost romantic and a classic man. Even when he showed himself in love with who would be his second wife, everyone sighed touched. Amanda and the sad man Gaiman was 47 years old when he met Amanda Palmer. It was the year 2008. He was already successful, but always seemed sad, despite his achievements. At 32, she was a passionate singer and feminist activist. She heard him admit he had never truly been in love. The first thing Amanda felt when she met Neil is that she was in front of someone extremely vulnerable. Things went smoothly between them and 3 years later they got married. Gaiman's comic reader started listening to Amanda, and Amanda's record listeners wanted to know Gaiman. Both were artists very beloved by their followers, and everyone saw in their union something organic and destined to work. At some point, when asked about the couple's success, Amanda and Neil mentioned that they had an open relationship. That kept a spark between them at least until 2014. Then they started to feel like nothing was the same anymore. Divorce loomed as a looming possibility at the same time Amanda discovered she was pregnant. The child they encountered made them reconsider their choices, and they chose to try again, having nothing to lose. Little happened after that, except some photos showing them together, always elegant, in Victorian and Gothic properties. In Gaiman, he took a plane ignoring the directions for coronavirus disease 2019 and publicly apologized for putting everyone at risk. It seemed like the first stain of an immaculate career. Truth be told, no one was too angry about that. The separation proceedings resumed after another 6 years. In February 2022, Amanda hired Scarlett Pavlovich, a young woman and admirer of hers, as a nanny. The girl soon showed empathy towards her son, so Amanda asked her if she could repeat her services, even taking care of the child. When she was at Neil's house, Scarlett agreed without knowing she was entering into the jaws of the wolf. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. After narrating the incident of the bathtub in which Gaiman had masturbated on her, the girl told how the man had continued harassing her on several occasions. He sent her messages calling her a slave, ordering her to call him master, and subjected her to multiple humiliations. He had sexual relations with her without her consent, even to the point of leaving her unconscious, forcing her to suck her own feces and eat her vomit. He rubbed his hand with the edge on her face and threatened her into performing oral sex on him while watching the first previews of the Sandman adaptation. He had also abused her with her son present and had used butter as lubricant. Palmer seemed devastated, but for some reason she was not surprised. Scarlett's horror was complete when the other admitted to her that it was not the first time someone had come to talk to her about Neil in those terms. She told her that when they were about to have the baby, he had mentioned in tears that he had an affair with a 20-year-old girl, even though they had agreed to end their open relationship. He had also crossed the line with a woman who lived on his property and who helped him with the maintenance of his extensive lands. Neil had taken advantage of the woman's vulnerability due to a recent separation and proceeded to sexually assault her. Amanda told Scarlett that her ex used to lie and behave like a sex addict. She said Neil was a womanizer attempting to change and she wanted to believe it. She assured her that it was not her intention to get her into that horrible situation. Scarlett cried all that night, and the next morning she found out that Gaiman wanted to help her by paying for her therapy. Through messages, he told her that he had believed everything was consensual, that his intention had not been to hurt her. Scarlett didn't know what to say and preferred to respond kindly. Today, she says she didn't fully grasp that she was a victim back then, that she should stop blaming herself for what happened to her. For a while, Neil Gamble sent her money as compensation and asked her to sign a confidentiality agreement. And everything could have stayed there. But after Scarlett had some attempts to take her own life, her friends forced her to visit some clinics for abuse survivors. There she found strength and realized she wasn't alone in facing the monster. After the statement, in January of 2023, Pavlovich filed a police report accusing Gaiman of sexual assault. An officer informed her that Palmer's cooperation was crucial for the case to proceed. Against all odds, Palmer chose to remain silent. From then on, his figure blurs. Many believe Amanda was Gaiman's accomplice, while others see her as another victim. A third group claims that the woman is only trying to remove herself from the center of the conflict to protect her son. On that occasion, Gaiman also didn't speak to the police but provided a written statement. In the same he said, and I quote, "Sexual degradation, bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism may not be to everyone's taste. But among consenting adults, bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, masochism is permissible." As is clear, Gaiman continued to maintain that what he did with Scarlett was consensual and understood within what is known as sadomasochistic practices. This was categorically denied by the victim. In July 2024, a British podcast revisited these controversies. It reviewed the case, revealing ominous precedents. According to what was learned from this investigation, the first altercation that Gaiman was involved in reportedly took place in 1986, when he had forcibly kissed a girl. Later, going into the 90s, he had seduced a fan with whom he had been particularly gentle. Then, when they had been alone, he had attacked her and asked her to give him her soul. The woman had been able to see how the publicly presented Gaiman succumbed to a threatening Gaiman who had cornered her in a corner. In 2003, Kendra South, an 18-year-old fanatic, had an intimate encounter with the author. He told her that when he was 20 years old, a woman had asked him to lash her in intimate areas. He was so naive that he didn't understand what she was talking about. Then she had shown him, and since then he had not been able to get aroused, unless it was through violence. They discussed sadomasochistic practices openly. Yet again, Gaiman didn't know when to stop. Despite the victim's screams and tears, he continued his relentless assault. Kendra experienced a painful urinary tract infection and pleaded with him not to do anything to her. That night, he abused her with particular force. In 2012, 22-year-old Catherine Kendall met Gaiman at an event in her city. He captivated her with his voice, the same one she said she would hear when she relaxed with her audiobooks. Everything had been idyllic until he had abused her in the back of a trailer. Out of nowhere, before she even had time to ask what was happening. Something similar happened to Rachel that same year. She was 20 years old and said that Gaiman was constantly interested in hurting and scaring her. All the testimonies agree that Neil Gaiman has an aggressive and manipulative personality. His defense tirelessly repeats that these are opportunistic accusations, that all the women who were with Neil sought that encounter, and they have even shown messages in which you can read the friendly way the man and the girls treat each other. Gaiman's lawyers believe that blackmail is the main motivation behind all the lies, while pointing to certain individuals as instigators and culprits. That the young women who had a good relationship with their client are suddenly interested in wanting to sue him. They even point to Palmer as being resentful about how things went in the divorce. Do they think she could be orchestrating everything? At the time of recording this video, justice still has yet to speak. Comic book fans start 2025 celebrating one of their most prominent icons. Finds most of the projects he was involved in cancelled. Adaptations, reprinting of Gaiman's works, and many of his pending contracts with publishers and brands have been halted or discontinued. With all of this exposed, intend the British writer Joanne Kathleen, Rowling expressed surprise at the silence of the literary community in the face of allegations against her multi-award-winning countryman. Can so many others not help but find a terrible analogy between some of Gaiman's stories and what we can see today? All of a sudden, it's as if it was discovered that Gaiman never was Sandman, as everyone believed, but one of his most sinister and dark characters. Perhaps we should never have forgotten that in any case, dreams and nightmares come from the same place.